Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Today is Friday, April 25th, day 567 of the war. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, joined by our diplomatic reporter, Lazer Berman. Lazer, I'm so glad to be back with you for the Friday Focus.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be back. I think I've been away for two of these. I'm sure the other reporters filled in admirably, but I'm glad to be back with you and with all of our listeners.
So there's some incidents that happened while you were gone, including an incident on the Temple Mount in which religious Zionist MK Zvi Sukkot visited the holy site during Passover. And there he participated in a prayer service and prostrated himself on the ground. Now, in years past, about 14 years ago, this same Sukkot was actually arrested for doing the same thing. So he is proclaiming that there's a tremendous change in policy. And in fact, National Security Minister Itamar Gvir, who he himself was on the Temple Mount a couple weeks prior to Sukkot's visit, is also touting a change and, of course, taking the credit for it. Now, Lazer, I was there in June 2018. And I witnessed with my very own eyes Jews praying on the Temple Mount then. So we're going to talk about the status quo. What is the status quo and whether there is such a change happening in the air on the Temple Mount when we're back. So, Lazer, while you were gone, some 6,315 Jews visited the Temple Mount over Passover, and that's a rise of about 37% over last Passover. But again, my question is there such a change? Is there some kind of trend that we're seeing? Or has prayer on the Temple Mount basically been taking place for decades, and either people didn't make such a fuss over it or weren't paying attention, perhaps? What are you seeing, Lazer?
So I think I would start with the idea of the status quo, which you mentioned, asked if the status quo has changed. Every time there's a blow up over the Temple Mount, and this happens, if you remember in 2023, when Itamar Gvir came or was in the early months of his office, he kept going up to the Temple Mount, and there was an uproar, including the United States, and Israel had to insist that there was no change to the status quo on the Temple Mount. I will say something that will surprise a lot of our listeners. The status quo on the Temple Mount does not exist.
Whoa, that was a mic drop moment, Lazer.
Yeah, drop this thing. There is a status quo among religious sites, many religious sites in Jerusalem. It is quite clearly codified, and we'll talk about where. It has never covered the Temple Mount. And we'll go deeper into this in a bit. There is an arrangement on the Temple Mount. It is not the capital status quo, capital S, capital Q, but it is an arrangement that has to be taken very seriously. So let's start with what is a status quo, first of all, in this regard. A status quo is not a sign that there has been some deep agreement reached between the sides. A status quo, especially what we're talking about here, is an acknowledgement that the conflicting parties cannot reach a written legal agreement. So what they decide to do, or what an outside power decides to do, is freeze the situation where it is. And that becomes the situation moving forward until such time as the parties can sit down and hammer out an agreement and a compromise between the sides. So it's an admission of failure in some ways. It's not necessarily the most just compromise either. It doesn't really have an element of justice. The idea is to prevent ongoing fights, bigger conflicts, and to freeze the situation. And if the situation is frozen, that means one side will have the upper hand, one side will be more powerful for whatever reason. It is often seen as, or also described as, something that enshrines the powerful at the expense of the weaker side, which might have better claims. So what is the status quo in Israel? And where did that come from? As we know, there are many faiths that have attachments to religious sites in Israel. And the Christian faith, which is not only one church, as we know, has its holiest sites here in the Holy Land, whether it's Jerusalem, Bethlehem, the Galilee, and other places. There, very quickly after the time of Jesus and the spread of Christianity, different sects emerge. And within those sects, there was a fight, naturally, over who would have control, privileges in these holy sites, especially in Jerusalem. Now, that became more acute with a couple of things that happened in history. One, the schisms between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox world, which was really the 11th century and then became permanent 4 centuries later. And the capture of this part of the region by Muslims in the 600s also added to that tension, that you had many of the same sites, including the Temple Mount, being core religious sites between different faiths, and there was a need to work them out. Now, when Muslims captured these regions, usually what happened was that it was unquestioned that the Muslims, through the different dynasties that ruled the area, were the rulers. No one could argue with that. But they gave allowances to the various Christian sects to administer what happens inside of churches and to pray there. This was dominated by the Catholic Church with the Crusades, when Latin entities came and physically held Jerusalem, but then they lost their hold on Jerusalem to Saladin in the 1200s. And they still were generally able to maintain dominance in the religious sites. The Ottoman Empire in the 1500s takes control of the vast majority of the region, the Middle East, obviously Turkey, some of Europe. And they prioritize the rights of the Catholics. But with time, there are changes that reflect the powers or the temporary hegemony of the different European powers. So the Russians were generally the backers of the Orthodox, especially the Greek Orthodox, who are quite dominant in Jerusalem. Powers like France and Spain represented the interests of the Catholic Church. And of course, there are other churches like the Armenians, which also have interests here. And there are a series of capitulations that the Ottoman Empire signs with various European powers. So when it's with France, France insists on not only economic rights, but the rights of the Catholic Church in the holy sites. And when it's with the Russians, then it is to the benefit of the Orthodox. 1757 is a big year. That is when the Catholic dominance is replaced by capitulations to the Orthodox. And that changes what happens in many sites, especially the Holy Sepulchre. And then with the rise of Napoleon and the French power, the Catholics start pushing back. And in the middle of the 1800s, the Ottoman emperor is absolutely fed up with these fights. There was actually physical fights in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre between Orthodox and Catholics. That's one of the reasons that the Crimean War broke out in the 1850s in Europe. And the Ottoman emperor says, I can't have these different European powers fighting and using me as a tool in their fights. And because either way, I'm going to be seen as offending in one of the sides, and it could really affect the Ottoman standing. So they come to a series of firmans, which are these decrees, which freeze and define the various times, schedules, prayers, privileges of the sects in the Holy Sepulchre and some other key sites. That, first of all, does not include the Temple Mount at all. And this really gets codified, one in the Treaty of Berlin, 1878, but also when the British come, the British mandate after World War I, and they are tasked with preserving the rights of the religious communities in the Holy Land. And they say, oh, well, we have to understand what exactly the religious rules are here. What are each side allowed to do? What do we have to protect? So they send a very serious officer. His name is Kusk, and he writes, and you can access this online, a very detailed history of the status quo and what the particular rights are of each community. This is 7 Christian sites, so it's dealing with an intra-Christian fight, but also 2 sites that are Jewish and Muslim sites. And what are those? The Western Wall and Rachel's tomb on the way to Bethlehem. Not the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount was seen then as exclusively a place of Muslim prayer. Anyone could go up. Doesn't matter, Jewish or whatever, anyone could walk around. There was absolutely no restrictions there. But the only places where there was Jewish prayer at a conflicted site was the Western Wall, which was seen as a Muslim site of ownership with Jewish prayer privileges, but very limited. If you brought chairs, if you brought a mechitza, it had to be brought in and then out. And Rachel's tomb as well. So not the Western Wall.
I'm really surprised, Laser, that the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron was not included on that list.
That's a good point, actually. I'm not exactly sure, but I would imagine that was seen, like the Temple Mount, as exclusively a place of Muslim prayer. And the fact that there were other visitors was not a problem. All these places were open to visitors. It was the prayer privileges that were under conflict. So that is the situation until 48. As we know, in 48, Israel does not capture the Temple Mount, does not capture the old city. So most of the shrines that would be problematic or part of the status quo are under Jordanian hands. And the Jordanian regime, the Hashemite regime, under agreements with the British that go back to the 20s, sees themselves as the protector of the shrines, both Christian and Muslim, in Jerusalem. And this is very central to the legitimacy of the Hashemites. They used to have Mecca and Medina. They lost that in a fight to the Al Saud, the Saudi dynasty. But the only thing they had left was the third holiest site in Islam, Haram al-Sharif, what we call the Temple Mount. And their protection of it was very important to their legitimacy as descendants of the prophets and as Muslim rulers. So they're very particular about that. For Israel, I'll note that Israel, except they actually endorsed this idea of the status quo and were willing to have the status quo sites come under international guarantees because Israel didn't hold them. They saw this as a way of forestalling attempts to internationalize the rest of Jerusalem. So if they could say the holy sites are what people care about, internationalize those, and then we'll define a list of other religious sites, and that will fall under Israeli law.
I would assume all of that changed in 1967. But before we move on to when Israel actually holds Jerusalem again, I just want to mention, archaeologically speaking, there's a project called the Temple Mount Sifting Project. And through that, we have evidence, of course, of Christian worship, at least on the Temple Mount, in different periods, meaning definitely during the Crusader time. And it's very clear that the Christians were praying on the Temple Mount during the Crusader time. But even prior to that, there are a lot of indications that in the early church, some of the early Christians went up to the Temple Mount and were praying there as well. It's quite fascinating to uncover all of this history because obviously nobody can have any kind of archaeological excavation on the Temple Mount. Such a flashpoint, even though there is apparently no status quo. So, Laser, let's go back to 1967, where everything changed. And obviously, great messianic fervor began among the Jews who wanted to return to the Temple Mount. So go ahead.
Sure, 1967, obviously, that famous war where Israel captures the Sinai, the Golan, the West Bank, and of course, what we call East Jerusalem, unifies, or some say liberates, the city of Jerusalem.
Some say conquers.
Some say conquered, occupied. I will say unifies. That happens on the second day of the war. Troops go up to the Temple Mount, and a dominant figure here is Rabbi Shmuel Goren, who's the IDF chief rabbi, and he holds by this Maimonides view that in order to bring about the Messiah, we should physically be the ones that build the third temple. And he actually urges Moshe Dayan and IDF leaders to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Says, the Arab world is in shock now. They're not going to be able to do anything, and it's military justified because we're shot at by snipers, so we can blow them up. And he actually organizes during the war, on the last day of the war, on June 10th, a rabbinical council on the Temple Mount to discuss where the actual temples were, and where it would be possible for Jews to go. Now, he thought there was a limited area where we could define where the temples were, so Jews could not go there today, but the northern and southern edges of that massive plaza, it shouldn't be a problem for Jews to go and even to build a synagogue there.
And if I'm not mistaken, Laser, he and some of his students began, in fact, studying sacred texts on the Temple Mount immediately.
Yep. Yeah, he actually got to work on it. They held Tisha B'Av prayers. They said that they were going to hold Yom Kippur prayers. Now, he was opposed by the the civilian chief rabbis at the time. It was Rav Nissim, who was the Sephardi, and I believe his name was Unterman, who was the Ashkenazi. And they held the Rashi Tosfot view that only God could create the third temple, and we're not supposed to, and therefore we should avoid going up onto the Temple Mount. And that generally was the view of the majority of the Chief Rabbi Council, and they met on this as well. And the security establishment adopted that view and pushed Goren, who would become Chief Rabbi in 72, from pursuing that. Now, he continued to pursue that as Chief Rabbi, but he was kind of on the outs. He was not taken very seriously halachically by that point, so he was not able to impose his will. Now, what happened there? Because until then, you had Jordanian dominance, and they would fund what is called this Islamic waqf on the site. A waqf is a religious trust. So if you have something and you want to give it in perpetuity for the good of the religious community, you establish a waqf. And there were several of them in that area. So there was one on the Temple Mount. There was one where today the Western Wall Plaza is. There was another one where the Southern Wall excavations are. Those were all waqfs. Israel was certainly willing to change the status quo that existed before in two of those waqfs, right? There was a status quo that Jews, couldn't pray under Jordanian occupation, and they were very limited under the British and the Ottomans, certainly. Israel leveled the Mughrabi neighborhood that was in front of the Western Wall, ultimately decided, by the way, under the opposition of the prime minister, Levi Eshkol, said it's offensive to build a synagogue there, but they actually said that there's going to be a synagogue. There were proposals to make the Western Wall an archaeological site, a Torah site. They said, no, it's going to be a synagogue. So they created a whole new reality there that has nothing to do with any religious status quo, even in violation of the British status quo. The Southern Wall, we know, became an excavation site, so they bought that land from that waqf as well. On the Temple Mount, the decision was made to prevent the whole Muslim world from intensifying its fight against Israel, and they would come to agreements with the Islamic Waqf over the running of the site. Now, the main interlocutor on Israel's part was not the government, it was generally the police. And they came to a series of arrangements with the Waqf, generally quiet arrangements, but arrangements that change with time. Right? So instead of a status quo, we can call it a modus vivendi, a way of living that is flexible, that is dynamic, that both sides are probably unhappy with. Now, you might ask me, first of all, what about religious worship there? Now, Israel has a law about all religious sites that they're all, they have freedom of access. If you and I want to walk into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which I like to do from time to time, there is nobody that can stop us. There are occasions when there's a religious ceremony when it's limited, but on principle, we can go in. And let's say the Western Wall. If you are a religious Muslim and you want to go to the Western Wall, you have access to do it. You could actually sit there and pray too. I've seen Muslims sitting there praying. Not a problem. Israeli law defines that. Why wouldn't Israeli law apply on the Temple Mount as well? Right? Well, the Supreme Court has ruled that it does. That went to 1993 when they actually had to rule on it. They absolutely, Aaron Barak, the famous former Chief Justice, said every Jew possesses the right to go up and to pray there. And it's Israeli freedom of worship, freedom of expression. But like all rights, they're not absolute. And since there is a danger to public order and to public safety, it can be limited, and that is the way with which the police takes the authority to limit what Jews do. But that still has changed, because in the 60s, you could absolutely walk up, go around, and even have access to all the sites. The Waqf would try to charge. It was a game. It was always a game. For example, the Waqf would always try to charge non-Muslims for going up. And then the police said, well, that you can't charge to go into religious sites in Israel. That's a violation of the law. So they moved their ticket booths further in to the plaza, and then they would charge for it was really for a guidebook. You pay $6 for the guidebook, and the guidebook would allow you access to the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa site and the museums. So there's this game that goes back on and forth.
I have to just add, Laser, the last time I was able to enter the Dome of the Rock was in 2001. And I believe that since then, essentially since the Second Intifada, they're just closing it to non-Muslims. For the most part, I think, of course, Prince William entered the Dome of the Rock. That was some kind of landmark visit. But for the most part, people are not allowed to enter the Dome of the Rock just to visit as tourists, regardless of the ticket price, etc. And I'll also note on several of my trips up there, I generally don't wear shorts there, but many tourists will wear shorts. And of course, once you get up to the top of the Temple Mount, many times men and women are given little wraparound skirts to put on to protect the sanctity of the site. It's always amusing to see, especially American tourists, men with their little skirts on at the top of the Temple Mount. Go ahead, Laser.
Yeah, so that is a perfect example of it being a modus vivendi and not a status quo, because in the 60s and 70s, you walk however you want. That there's an increase in the say Islamization, but it's gotten more conservative. The Waqf has moved in a certain direction, and Israel is not really going to interfere there, because both sides can use the other side and both sides have an interest in cooperating. So the threat that the Waqf and also Jordan and the Palestinians can hold over Israel is that they can, basically it's violence. They can provoke violence on the Temple Mount or even outside. That's something that Israel wants to avoid. Israel understands that they are giving up tangible sovereignty over much of what happens there, but they're better off doing that. And it's really quiet cooperation. It's really this ongoing conversation between the Waqf officials and the police. Again, there's nothing written even. You could not find a written document which lays out exactly what the rights are. It's not like what happens in the Holy Sepulchre.
There's nothing, for example, in our treaty with Jordan.
So let's get to Jordan. All right, so 93, what's the big change is that there's the Oslo Accords, and the Palestinians start to assert their own position as the dominant, or the desire to, as the dominant force there. But again, for Jordan, this is so crucial. So in 94, they insisted that their custodianship be recognized. Israel, of course, over Muslim and Christian sites, right? So that would mean they would have this custodianship, whatever that means, but it's certainly something that's significant well into different parts of Jerusalem. Think anywhere there's a church. Of course, Israel's not going to let that happen. So all it says, first of all, Israel has never recognized Jordan's custodianship over anything, over any holy sites. Article 9 of the treaty, Israel respects the present special role of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in Muslim holy shrines in Jerusalem. So first of all, not Christian and not a custodianship, just special role. When negotiations on permanent status will take place, I would assume that means permanent status with the Palestinians, Israel will give high priority to the Jordanian historic role in these shrines. It's a historic role. It's not a custodianship. It's much less. Jordanian officials will always talk about their custodianship. That's in their heads. If Israel didn't agree to it, they don't have it. Some American officials will sometimes make that mistake as well. But
yeah, that is incredibly important to emphasize, I think, because so many American officials and definitely the American media always goes bonkers whenever any kind of, Israeli politician goes up and talks about the status quo, that Israelis are breaking the status quo yet again and flaunting their power and blah, 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 blah. So why is this happening? Why is this mistake being perpetuated?
One, there's an interest to perpetuate it. Of course, status quos, like I said, are a power game. They're not inherently fair or just or anything like that. And if you say status quo, right, people know there's a status quo with Holy Sepulchre, and it goes way back. Is it Crusades? Is it Ottomans? It goes back, and it's something accepted, and it's formalized into law. So if you use that same terminology for the Temple Mount, it makes Israel seem like it's this violator of international law. So that's why it needs to be stressed again and again. There's no status quo. There's nothing written about the Temple Mount. There are a series of mostly informal agreements between the two sides on how to work, and those things shift. Like you said, when the Second Intifada broke out in 2000, things changed drastically. One, non-Muslim visitors were limited where they could go. There was no more Dome of the Rock or Al-Aqsa. And the Israeli police presence also was enhanced as well. And at different times, Israeli police could be more or less aggressive. They'd obviously prefer that this be done, that quiet be handled by the Waqf, but they understand that is they're ultimately responsible for the security arrangements going in and out. Now, you'll remember in 2017, there was, I believe, 3 policemen who were killed by Muslim worshippers who had snuck guns onto the Temple Mount, and Israel shut down the site for a couple of days. And then when they opened it, there was metal detectors, which is pretty reasonable after 3 policemen got killed.
I mean, my high school had metal detectors. I think it is pretty reasonable to have this holy site.
Right, especially there, right? But that was seen as an assertion of Israeli sovereignty and was ultimately rejected. And Israel under Netanyahu had to remove those metal detectors. So again, there's nothing defined here. Both sides will claim violations of the status quo when a change is made that they don't like, but ultimately it's worked out either between Israel and the Waqf directly, which is the day-to-day. Sometimes it'll go higher. It will go between Jordan and Israel. And if Jordan wants to get other countries involved, like the U.S., I think Kerry was involved in it. He was in a 2014 arrangement after an increase of violence that many call the Al-Aqsa Intifada, after alleged Israeli status quo violations there as well. So that's really what's important to understand. It's a changing dynamic, and the Temple Mount is not at all a static site in any way. It's a living site. Just what goes on there. You have the mosque, you have Al-Aqsa, right? You have the Dome of the Rock shrine. You also have an Islamic museum. You have 2 boys' schools. You have a girls' school. You have housing up there. So and you have workers, you have Waqf workers, you have local workers. There's a whole life going on there. So it's not something that can physically remain static. It's not like the Holy Sepulchre where it's only a shrine.
I mean, there are soccer games being played up there. I think people have no idea how much of a life there is going on up there because it's considered this very forbidden place by most of, I don't know, at least most of the world, especially for Jews to go up there. But again, every time I've been up there, I've seen dozens, if not, I don't know, hundreds of Jews up there, many of them praying. And this has been going on since I first visited in 2000, not 2001, in 2000. So how do you explain this misconception? And also, based on this very misconception, our national security minister is considered a pyromaniac, and obviously he is using this Temple Mount issue as a way to draw, fans and disciples into his own worldview. But I still don't fully understand how this has become such this flashpoint gray area.
Sure. So there's no question that there are growing Third Temple movements and growing support amongst Israelis, not only to go up to the Temple Mount, which is still officially forbidden by the chief rabbinate, tells Jews not to, but there's more and more that do. But there's also a growing movement to rebuild the Third Temple. Right. So that is something that Israelis increasingly want. And they ask, okay, if we have declared sovereignty over Jerusalem and the Temple Mount is our holiest site, it is no other religion's holiest site, what are we doing? Why are we playing this game? If we should build it, if we don't think we should build it, we should at least have the right to pray up there. If Muslims want to pray as well, great. We can pray in the same place. That shouldn't be a problem. So I think that is actually an issue where there's broader support for that issue compared to other far right issues that Ben Gvir's party would promote, or Smotrich's party. There's probably much broader support for that amongst the Israeli public. Now, basically, you can go up and pray quietly, and even you do it pretty demonstrably at times too. The police are, because this is a changing situation, they're much less restrictive now. And there was a time when you would go up and you would have people yelling at you, or these women that are hired to monitor everything you do and really get in your face. That doesn't happen anymore. The police are much more aggressive about protecting Jews that go up there, and the right to quietly worship. But, being so demonstrative about it, especially publicly, and going in front of cameras and saying you're doing it, of course, you're provoking a response from the Palestinians, from Jordan, and probably from Israel's allies in the West as well. It's not the smartest, but there's no question that the goalposts have moved in a direction that is increasingly permissive of the Jewish right to freedom of prayer in their holy sites.
Where do you see this in about, 10 years? Where do you see the non-status quo, but the, what do you call it, modus vivendi? Where do you see this in 10 years, in another decade?
The big question is what will happen diplomatically, because ultimately this is really a diplomatic issue. The status quo was as well. If there is some agreement with the Palestinian Authority, then there will have to be a written decision on what happens there, or they might kick the can down the road like they did with the Jordanians. But there will have to be some sort of agreement what happens there. It's hard to imagine that the Palestinians would agree to any sort of Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, but who knows? That's if the Palestinian Authority still exists in a decade. Assuming that the agreement with Jordan still exists in a decade, I think chances are it does, it will. And assuming that the Hashemite regime in Jordan is still in power, then I think both sides will continue. It'll be a source of stress for both sides. It'll continue to strain the relationship, but they will both understand that the relationship is more important to preserve, and it's better to come to these ad hoc solutions. I think Jews will continue to push to go up. I think it will continue to grow as something that is the norm. The chief rabbinate's position will continue to be weakened, and there will continue to be a source of stress. And sadly, there will probably be outbreaks of violence and terrorism because of either what happens up on the Temple Mount or false reports of what happens, and all these conspiracies about, Jews trying to undermine the Temple Mount. So I think we're going to see an intensification of the trends that we have talked about and that you've pointed out.
Lazer, thank you as usual for joining me, and I'm so glad to have you back for our Friday focus.
Thank you. Glad to be back here, and I hope all of our listeners out there are doing well and will join us next week for our next Friday focus, but we will announce the topic soon, right?
Once we think of it, right, Lazer?
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for listening to today's Friday Focus. Please subscribe to all of our different channels. And please, if you are so inclined, drop us an email at podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. Until next week, shalom.